One day in 1965, in the shop of celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, a TV producer named William Dozier would begin talking about a project he was working on. He would tell Sebring that he was looking for an Oriental actor who speaks English and can handle action, someone with leading man charisma. That was a near impossible request in Hollywood at the time. Jay Sebring, however, did have someone. I have your guy. There's a film of him at Long Beach. He will blow you away. Jay Sebring was a karate student as well as a hairstylist and was referring to a film captured at the 1964 Long Beach International Karate Championships. That film would show a man demonstrating a series of moves, including sending a volunteer flying with what he called a 1-inch punch. But more importantly, the film included a follow-up lecture the man gave, openly criticizing classical systems and advocating for a more open, fluid, modern approach to martial arts. As one person who was in attendance that day said, he got up there and began to flawlessly imitate all of these other styles, and then, one by one, he began to dissect them and explain why they wouldn't work, all in front of an audience packed with karate traditionalists who had each spent tens of thousands of hours practicing their techniques. William Dozier was interested. So, on January 21st, 1965, Jay Sebring drove the film over for a screening at William Dozier's offices at 20th Century Fox. As soon as Dozier saw it, he knew he'd found his man. And just like that, Bruce Lee was discovered by Hollywood. My name's Justin Campbell-Platt, and welcome to Icons, a podcast where I dive deep into the process and philosophy behind history's greatest makers. And this story comes from Matthew Polly's excellent biography that I read in preparation for this episode, alongside watching several documentaries on and a bunch of films from the martial artist, actor, and filmmaker we all know and love. The biography is simply titled Bruce Lee, A Life. And even though the book doesn't start with this story, I've started the podcast with it because it acts as a catalyst for a very pivotal moment in the martial artist's life. It's the catalyst that would shortly have Bruce Lee stood in front of a camera doing his first screen test, be it for a show that doesn't get made, but ultimately lands Bruce Lee his first Hollywood-produced TV appearance. And it's in this appearance that Bruce Lee would introduce American audiences to Gung Fu, or Kung Fu as it will be later renamed in America, and we will refer to it as Kung Fu for the rest of this podcast. But to me, until I read this book and properly sat down to watch a collection of Bruce Lee's films, Bruce Lee was more a myth than he was a person. And admittedly, he's almost like a fictional character, and he may even be that way for you too. I mean, everyone knows his name, right? And most people have probably seen what he looks like and might even know the screams he makes when he fights in a film. But I think few people actually know who Bruce Lee the man is, or truly understand the gravity of his impact. For example, despite having died at the young age of 32, Bruce Lee founded mixed martial arts. Even UFC's own Dana White has said that himself. And despite having only appeared in one Hollywood-produced film, his appearance would inject Hollywood with a new interest in martial arts, paving the way for actors like Chuck Norris, Donnie Yen, Jet Li, Jean-Claude Van Damme, and yes, Jackie Chan. And yet, even with this incredible legacy, Bruce Lee was simply a man. In fact, he was very frail and ill as a child and was unable to walk until he was 4 years old. He was kicked out of school twice for bullying, even once bringing a knife into school and pointing it at his teacher. As an adult, he was someone who seemed egocentric and overly arrogant at times. And he even commits adultery numerous times, despite eventually having 2 children with his loving wife. But I say all of this not to reduce his reputation, but to unveil the man behind the myth, to make him and what we can learn from him creatively more accessible to us. Because whilst he's clearly very eloquent, when you watch him in interviews, his choices and actions speak louder. And with that, let's begin this episode of Icons, where we'll explore the creative lessons bred from studying the fascinating martial artist Bruce Lee. We'll cover many incredible lessons, including how Bruce's many names shaped who he was, why Bruce had to remain busy, and what happened if he became restless. This will really shock you. How Bruce used the time that he was banished from Hong Kong as an opportunity. how Bruce began to understand and harness the double-edged nature of his intensity, how he abandoned tradition and adopted and mixed his martial arts styles, how he got clear about his artistic vision and wrote his screenplay, and how Bruce Lee chose when to negotiate and when not to negotiate. We will be learning all of this throughout this episode. And as always, all the films, articles, and interviews I reference throughout the episode is listed in the description. So there's no need to frantically Google anything as you listen to this. Growing up, Bruce Lee was a child of many names. And let me explain how. Born on November 27th, 1940, Bruce Lee was a baby, 5/8 Han Chinese, 1/4 English, and 1/8 Dutch Jewish. But his mixing is not just in his blood. He's born to his mother, Grace Ho, who came from one of the wealthiest families in Hong Kong, yet who risked being disowned by being with Bruce's father, Lee Hoi-chuen, a man who came from a poor background, thrusted into stage acting from a very young age. This mix was further instilled as whilst Bruce's 3 siblings born before him were all born in Hong Kong, Bruce is actually born in San Francisco. This theme of mixing will continue throughout Bruce's life, but when Bruce's father learns of his birth, he celebrates with the cast of the theatre he worked at by passing out cigarettes, which is kind of like the Chinese equivalent of passing out cigars, as kind of noted in this book here. And the first questions from his fellow actors was, what are his astrological signs? And notice they said signs and not sign, right? Because in the Chinese zodiac, there's not only an assigning of one of the 12 animals to the year of the person's birth, but also the month and one for the day and one for the hour. The book actually notes, I'll quote it directly here. It says, Hoi-chuen proudly told everyone that his boy was born in the year of the dragon, the month of the pig, the day of the dog, and the hour of the dragon. 2 dragon signs, especially if one was the year, were considered exceptionally auspicious. The troop all congratulated him. Your son is destined for greatness. And that he was. To continue reading from the book, when Li Hoi-chuen applied for his non-immigrant visa, his surname was changed from Li, spelled L-I, to the anglicized version, Lee, spelled L-E-E, so Li Hoi-chuen. And so on the boy's birth certificate, his last name was also written down L-E-E, Li, a subtle shift in spelling to marking a break from the past and a new beginning. For the first name, Grace consulted with the midwife who delivered the baby and signed the birth certificate. She suggested Bruce. So while you might have assumed, like I did, that Bruce Lee's name was an Americanized name later in his life, he was actually born with this name that we now know him to have, Bruce Lee. That said, his mother Grace also gave him a Chinese name, Li Jun-fan. Li, the family surname, Jun was part of Hoi-chun's father's name, Li Junbao, and meant shake up, rouse, or excite. And Fan is the Chinese character actually used for San Francisco. So you put all these together, Bruce Lee's Chinese name meant shake up and excite San Francisco. Now, I mentioned earlier that Bruce Lee was very frail and weak as a child. This was no exaggeration. In fact, he was so weak that his parents feared for his death. As Bruce's parents moved back to Hong Kong within a year of Bruce being born, the book notes the kind of contrast from San Francisco's peaceful, chill air to the new, humid, cockroach-infested wartime environment that Bruce now found himself in. And it's likely here that Bruce was exposed to cholera, which was an outbreak at the time that ravaged Hong Kong. But this frailty and illness would not hold back a slightly older Bruce, who, now cured of his illness, would move so much that his family gave him a new nickname. And this is why I'm mentioning this, because we can add another name to his collection of names. The name given here is It Never Sits Still. This energetic spirit captured in this name refers to the fact that he was jumping, talking, playing, moving all day, and was also coupled with the kind of level of skepticism that had him questioning everything that his parents told him to do. And I think this is something that he very much carries on into the rest of his life. But this name, or with this trait, he was actually given another nickname of Y Baby, literally W-H-Y baby. So Y Baby. The only time that you could find never sit still, sitting still, or not asking why, is when he reads comic books. And, the book notes here, as he would read quietly for hours. Prior to the advent of television in Hong Kong in 1957, comic books and magazines like The Children's Paradise were a form of entertainment. Bruce started with Kung Fu comics and graduated to the sword and sorcery martial arts novels, devoting much of his time in bookstores. Bruce read so much that his mother believed it caused him to be nearsighted, and Bruce began wearing corrective glasses at the age of 6. Again, small detail, but it's fascinating how I never knew that Bruce Lee was nearsighted. But, these are the little details that you find out about a person when you read a biography as well written as Matthew Polly's here. But as you can start to already see, a martial art influence has begun to sow its seeds in Bruce through these books. And in fact, the book notes that with this extensive reading, the comic books and fantasy novels created a rich inner life. As he read, Bruce imagined himself as the story's hero. Once Grace rebuked her son for acting selfishly. "You are really no use, child. You seem to hardly have any soft spot for your own family." And to this, Bruce defended himself, telling a story that if we were ever walking in the forest and came across a tiger, I'd stay and fight the tiger and let the rest of you escape. I love that Bruce Lee, already at this young age, is allowing himself the influence of these stories and ideas of using martial arts to defend himself and his family to manifest in these kind of imaginary situations. And immediately, I have to say, this reminds me of the director Hayao Miyazaki, who we've covered in this podcast before, who also spent a lot of his childhood deeply immersed in reading fantasy novels. And these became, the inspirations for his later art as he pictured himself as the hero or imagined ways in which he would be able to help others through these stories. But beyond comics and novels, another realm that never sits still, loved was movie sets. Bruce's father, Chun, having graduated from stage actor to movie actor in Hong Kong, allowed him to bring Bruce to the set with him. The book notes, as part of the nascent movie industry, Chun was friendly with all major players, often inviting them over to his home. He brought his children on set with him. None of them took to the jungle gym-like backlots with as much excitement as Never Sit Still. Bruce climbed the wooden ladders to reach the suspended studio lights. He wanted to touch everything from the cameras to the sound equipment, remembers one of the actresses, Feng So-po. He was so naughty, they had to teach him hand games in order to distract him. It's funny because even this reminds me of traveling with my father's work. He works in food science, but he worked across the world. And so I would find myself coming with him as part of his travels. And I remember that one of my mum's friends that she had made through this work actually taught me a hand game as well. So it was so funny reading about this and recalling stories in my mind or memories in my mind of when I had to be distracted. Maybe I was never sit still at the time as well at my father's work. And so had to be distracted with hand games. But the impact that all of this had for the 6-year-old Bruce Lee was significant because the director of Chun's latest film actually saw Bruce and offered him a part in the film. And whilst Bruce and his father both thought the director was joking, Bruce was also, according to his mother Grace, wide-eyed, open-mouthed, and deliriously happy. But it was real. And in his first part, Bruce Lee played a runaway boy who becomes a pickpocket, but is eventually run over by a truck in the Cantonese tearjerker known as The Birth of Mankind. It kind of sounds like the plot of one of Charlie Chaplin's films. The book notes that it was a fairly forgettable flick that flopped at the box office, but it's only notable for typecasting young Bruce as a tough, wily street urchin with a heart of gold, a kind of artful dodger. It was a character he would play repeatedly for the rest of his childhood acting career. And that's true because by the time that Bruce was 10 years old, he would be performing in his 5th role in a film called Son-A-Chang. Bruce plays an orphan boy in this film. And as the book notes, in one scene, he humorously imitates his teacher. In another, he puffs himself with a cocky bravado by throwing his shoulders back and thumbing his nose. And when I read this, I thought not too much of it. But then when watching his films later, I realized this throwing the shoulders back, thumbing his nose became a recognizable kind of description as something that the adult Bruce Lee would actually do plenty of times in his other films. The thing is, Son-A-Chang doesn't just give Bruce Lee's new physical mannerisms a place to shine, but it also gives him another name. In fact, the film's opening credits mention that the film will feature a young Bruce Lee billed as Li Long, also known as Dragon Lee. And due to his stature, Dragon Lee would also quickly become Little Dragon Lee. This was a name that Bruce Lee loved so much that he insisted on using it in his private life. And from then on, all of his friends called him Little Dragon Lee, having sometimes no idea that his birth name was actually Li Zhongfan. As the book notes, if names have a magical power, this film marked the moment that Little Dragon Lee's personal life and movie persona began to merge, overlap, and bleed into each other. And I think this is partly also responsible for why we think of Bruce Lee as a character more than a person sometimes, because he himself made that to be so. And the lessons here are subtle but meaningful. First is, of course, the power of names. After all, names are usually the first form of identity association. Like if you've ever heard the expression, oh yeah, he looks like a Steve or a Dave, that's that kind of happening. That's when you already know how the names transcend the individual who you know to have that name. It's the power of names, and names like Jackie Chan or Coco Chanel, these are names that transcend the individuals, becoming cultural symbols and invoking entire legacies. From a young age, Bruce was given names with a lot of associations and thus a lot of weight and power, stuff that he would have been maybe not consciously aware of, but definitely subconsciously aware of, at least to want to take them into his private life. So even for a young Bruce Lee, of course, his real name would go on to have the most significant impact in his life, but at school, Little Dragon Lee had the most power. Secondly, as another lesson, I'd highlight that Bruce Lee's father here, Hui Chen, didn't actually approve of Bruce acting so much as a child. In fact, Hui Chen had only experienced stage acting as being a not very lucrative career option. He himself actually made most of his wealth from a series of very lucky and well-timed real estate investments made amidst Hong Kong's changing occupation from Japanese to Americans, which had the market prices fluctuating like crazy. So he knew that a lot of that was timing, good fortune, luck, all of that at play. So the idea of his son going into stage acting was not something that he wanted. In fact, he wanted all of his children to thrive in careers that he personally believed would provide better economic stability. We're talking things like doctors, lawyers, bankers. And yes, of course, these may be projections. Maybe the grass is greener on the other side. But, he wanted what was best for his children. And yet, Hui Chen, almost by force of Bruce's sheer talent and impact of those who saw him on set, allowed Bruce to act in film whilst attending school. And I can imagine that any parent who wishes for their child to have a better life and perhaps, as I mentioned, therefore, like a different career to the one that they had, they might have resistance when giving their child direction. But just note that for as long as your child looks up to you, they will value what you do, just like Bruce Lee did, who fell in love with the career that Hui Chen found himself bound to. And so really, there was no stopping his son. And so the best move here was to support him, which is what he did. Unfortunately, that support would not come easy. And in fact, it'd be taken away several times. A revelation I had in reading this biography and learning about the man behind the myth is that Bruce Lee was not always a shining star. In fact, he was very much a diamond in the rough growing up, because Bruce Lee, when he was at school, fought a lot. I'll actually read directly from the book here that says, most scrawny, four-eyed boys would have hidden in the corner, downcast, lost in fantasy. But not Bruce. Just like his character, my Son-A-Chang, he was pugnacious and short-tempered. Anyone who teased him and made him lose face, he fought right then, right there. It didn't matter if they were bigger or smaller, taller or shorter, older or younger, he fought them all until he developed a reputation and the other boys stopped picking on him. And if I stop here, this might be seen as admirable, right? A characteristic that we can easily all rally behind. I mean, to stand your ground, to not tolerate bullying. These are great values, but unfortunately, this isn't where we stop. Because I'll continue from the book, which writes, whilst Bruce started out defending himself against insults, he quickly acquired a taste for combat, and soon he was instigating fights himself. His reputation shifted from someone you didn't want to mess with to the boy it was best to avoid. Parents began warning their sons to stay away from him. This taste for power found in fighting didn't stop here. And rather than going to his tutor like he told his mum he was doing after school, Bruce instead formed a gang and spent most of his afternoons in the streets of Hong Kong. And to be fair, this word gang is used, but it's more of that of a bunch of pranksters rather than, gangsters. But even then, his pranks were very extreme. I mean, one even had Bruce and his friend inserting a firecracker into a bucket filled with human feces and then sliding that bucket under a toilet door to an unsuspecting theatre ticket taker. But if you pair this bad behavior with his bad school grades and constant fighting, now his parents, who felt that their well-known family reputation was being single-handedly disgraced, looked to punish their son. Hui Chen opted to ban Bruce from what he loved doing most. And this is where the support unfortunately took his bad turn and they banned him from acting. This happened twice, in fact, once stopping Bruce from appearing in a sequel to My Son-A-Chang, which was obviously his big breakout role. And then there was a banning again, which took him on a 2-year hiatus following a lack of improvement, of course, in his behavior. The book notes, far from being stage parents, Hui Chen and Grace viewed acting as a privilege and not as a career, to be taken away if Bruce didn't study hard. He didn't want one of his sons to miss out on good education or make the same mistakes he had. So you can see where, although I mentioned there was good support, the importance was still placed on education, something that he didn't have himself and so wanted his children to have. But by 1951, as fifth grader, Bruce was actually sent to Catholic school and a very prestigious secondary school in Hong Kong known as La Salle, a school that very importantly taught its students English, producing bilingual graduates. And this is important because, of course, without his elite education here at La Salle, Bruce Lee wouldn't have been able to make it to Hollywood, where the ability to speak English is almost a prerequisite, especially for Asian actors. But despite this important form of impact, the school had minimal impact on his overall behavior. In fact, during his 5 years of attendance at La Salle, he was held back twice. In the most extreme of behaviors, Bruce actually brought many weapons into school, including brass knuckles, but also culminating to him bringing a knife and pulling it on his teacher, which is a move that, by the way, he'll later replicate in a future movie where his character does the same thing. But this is still a terrible thing for a child to be doing at school. But weirdly, this wasn't even the act that got him into the most trouble. It was rather when he bullied another student by asking them to drop their trousers for then Bruce to throw paint on this child's private parts. It was this that ultimately got him expelled, which had him grounded by his parents for a year. As the book puts, it was a tremendous loss of face for his proud family. As his mother searched for a new school for Bruce, his frustrated father grounded him for a year, which meant no movie work, no nights out with friends, only school and home. What's really worth noting here, though, is that whilst Bruce's behavior was extreme, it actually only occurred during periods where Bruce felt restless. And this is noteworthy because amidst his 5 years at La Salle, Bruce actually had a near 3-year period where he appeared in 10 movies. And as this book notes, these 3 years were the most prolific of Bruce's entire film career, comprising of nearly half of his oeuvre. And oeuvre basically refers to an entire body of someone's work. His small roles in these movies established Bruce in the minds of the public as a character actor and not a star, someone whose face they might recognize but whose name they probably couldn't recall. But this time was extremely valuable in helping Bruce define his own style. Chung Lin, the director of these films, as the book notes, provided Bruce with an elite education in how to make quality films about serious subjects at a Hong Kong pace. Most of the film shoots lasted only 12 days, and the company's ideals also influenced Bruce as an adult filmmaker. He grew up wanting to make patriotic, educational movies about China's cultural heritage. This emphasis, by the way, on making films quickly and then filling them with both entertainment and a deeper meaning reminded me heavily of the style of Charlie Chaplin. I know I've already mentioned him once, but he adopted this in his filmmaking process, starting small, moving quickly and portraying humanity through drama. But it's when the artistic union of Chun Liang fell apart and there was no remaining work for Bruce to take on that left him without a creative outlet and structure to his days, and ultimately gave him the space to turn his teenage attention back to fighting and troublemaking. So that's why I mentioned this idea of him being restless. To me, this seems like the teenage manifestation of Bruce's nickname, Why Baby. It's a questioning, albeit, a violent one of authority. Bruce clearly hated school, his teachers, and anyone of authority. Now for me, someone who's only known Bruce as the man that, who I heard to have this desire to be open and flow like water, this felt so out of character. But in a way, Bruce's father saw it coming, because even before getting into trouble, Bruce's father got a sense that his son, never sit still, was going to be trouble. So when his son was 7 years old, he began to bring his son to King's Park in the morning in Hong Kong to practice Tai Chi with him. And Tai Chi is this slow, meditative art form which, as the book puts it, uses soft to conquer hard and stillness to conquer speed, which ended up being Bruce Lee's first style of martial arts. But for Hui Chen, it was a simple attempt to calm his son down. And this wouldn't stick forever, admittedly, as Bruce Lee would later go on to say about Tai Chi, that I got tired of it quickly. It was no fun for a kid. It was just a bunch of old men. But more importantly for Bruce, it was not giving him the practical tools to do what he was interested in doing most at that time, which was fighting. It's worth noting that Gung Fu or Kung Fu was not popular in Hong Kong when Bruce Lee was growing up. It was associated with the rural countryside, China's feudal past, and the triad criminality really helped to keep it away from mainstream attention. In 1954, after a challenge match that showcased a fight between a 53-year-old traditionalist who was the head of the Hong Kong Tai Chi Association and a 34-year-old modernizer who had studied white crane kung fu, Japanese judo, and Western boxing, the Hong Kong tabloids were eager to make news of this open challenge. As the book notes, it was effectively a challenge between old and young, past versus future, purity versus fusion, closed versus open, and nationalism versus globalism. But then disaster struck Hong Kong on Christmas night in 1953. A fire destroyed a squatter shantytown, leaving 53,000 people homeless. And in response, the two combatants of this challenge agreed to turn their fight into the centerpiece of a charitable relief event. And the book notes that it was a joining of the martial arts, complete with an entire evening of kung fu exhibitions and opera singing. And eventually held in Macau, as opposed to Hong Kong, it was marketed as the fight of the century, and it took place there in Macau. But the fight did not pan out to be the spectacle most expected it to be. And in fact, the amateurish display was even called off early by even more amateurish judges who panicked at the first sight of blood. And this meant that the competition was to be called a draw, which left many spectators, or admittedly gamblers, frustrated, mostly due to their bets being unsettled. But the impact of this night was still extremely significant, because following the event, Kung Fu became fashionable in Hong Kong, and many students flooded to then tiny martial arts studios. As the book notes, young Bruce Lee, already a veteran street fighter, was drawn to the competition of these illicit rooftop contests. This led him to make a decision that would change his life. He began the formal study of Kung Fu. And Bruce did switch schools after being expelled at La Salle, but this didn't stop him from getting into trouble. He and his gang were still fighting. In a quote from Bruce Lee himself in the Black Belt magazine, Bruce admits, "As a kid in Hong Kong, I was a punk and went looking for fights. We used chains and pens with hidden knives inside them. Then, one day, I wondered what would happen if I didn't have my gang behind me if I got into a fight. I only took up Kung Fu when I began to feel insecure." The book extends on this to say, like many young toughs, the little dragon didn't study martial arts to become a better person, but a better street fighter. Not for self-defense, but self-offense. Which reminds me, of course, of 50 Cent, who got into boxing because he wanted to be more intimidating in his presence on the streets. One day, Bruce runs into another kid in his neighborhood who shared his desire to fight, William Cheng, who was the son of a police officer. The problem was, William was older, bigger, a much better fighter than Bruce. And so, as their friendship grew, Bruce needed to make a difficult decision that he had not yet faced. He could either avoid William and maintain his status as a leader of a small gang at school, or, as the book notes, he could swallow his pride, hail William as big brother, and become one of his followers. This decision was mostly difficult, by the way, because it directly attacked Bruce's ego, which was notoriously high. Never before had he joined a gang. He only created his own. He loved being a leader with a cool nickname, not a follower with no name. But where most, with such egos would have been unable to swallow their pride, Bruce, admittedly, chose to temporarily follow William. Why? Because this way he felt he could study William's technique more closely and eventually become the better fighter. By being submissive, he was deploying a short-term move to eventually reverse the power dynamic in the long term. From this, Bruce soon discovers that William's street talent was the result of a study of an obscure art of Kung Fu called Wing Chun. And Wing Chun's popularity was growing across Hong Kong, mostly due to one man, Ip Man. And to those who recognize that name, it's likely because there have been a series of films made about him where he's played by a more recently famous martial artist turned actor, Donnie Yen. As a teacher of Wing Chun, Ip Man attracted a flurry of angry young men who were drawn to his talent, temper, and quick wit, all characteristics that we can later credit Bruce's on-screen characters for having. Well, here's the thing, Ip Man even taught his students Taoist philosophy, but in particular one idea that one should be calm like water, which will sound familiar for those of you who know the ideas that Bruce Lee's legacy had left behind, but we'll come back to that. Bruce asked William Chang to introduce him to Ip Man, who then accepted the then 15-year-old movie actor. Bruce practiced all night, all day, and whilst he did learn the style quickly, he was extreme, but that wasn't unique. And in fact, Ip Man often pitted his students against each other, which created a kind of competitive dynamic where, everyone wanted to be top dog, everyone wanted to be the best. And this dynamic actually extended to other rival Kung Fu schools, which led the students of Kung Fu taking to the rooftops for secret matches. And these were bare-knuckle challenges called biemo in Cantonese. When it came time for Bruce to have his challenge, where he would be representing the school of Wing Chun, he had a battle of 2 rounds. But during the first round, he was actually punched several times in the face, which left him with a swollen eye and a bloodied mouth. And in response to this, Bruce attacked quick in anger. But by doing this, didn't land so many of his attacks and ultimately left himself open to counter punches, which landed on his nose and cheek. And after this first round, where Bruce noticed the impact that the fight was already having on his appearance and realized how difficult it was going to be to hide his damage done to his parents, particularly his father, he told his cornerman, look, my performance is bad today. If I am hurt too badly, my father will notice. I think we better take it as a draw and end the match now. But his cornerman quickly reminded him that by throwing in the towel before the second round, he'd be asking for a loss, not a draw. But that same cornerman also gave Bruce a sense of hope. You are capable to fight on. Your opponent is wheezing now, and if you withdraw, you will regret it. Whether you win or not is not important, but you must try your best. If you fight on, you will win. But then he gave the words of advice that will go on to shape how he fought for the rest of that fight. Don't worry about whether you've been hit. Try to get close and attack, and be calm. Back up on his feet in the second round, Bruce stood in the center of the rooftop with an air of composure that he lacked in that first round. He faked a strike at his opponent. His opponent jumps back. He did this again and again with the same response. Bruce smirked. He did this once more, which resulted in his opponent only stepping half back a step while attempting to throw a right punch and seeing his opponent off balance. Bruce made use of this opening and swiftly charged forward. As the book notes, his left punch slammed into Chung's face. Bruce took another step forward and smacked Chung with a right to the jaw so hard that several of Chung's false teeth were knocked across the roof. Blood gushed from Chung's mouth, and his legs were wobbly as he stumbled backwards. With a yell, Bruce continued to rain heavy punches on Chung's face. Finally, he fell beside the water tank on the roof. Chung's friends ran forward to stop the match. Bruce was overjoyed. He raised his hands in the air in victory. If this sounds, by the way, like something straight out of a Bruce Lee film, you're not alone, because I read this section before sitting down to watch the run of his films, and this fight came back to me, because everything we know of Bruce Lee's style of fighting on screen is right there in that fight, the faking of an attack, smirking at the opponent slipping up, and the rain of heavy punches, all trademarks that would be established in his later fight scenes. There are two lessons we can take away from Bruce's deep interaction initially with martial arts. First, it's to, as Bruce did, find and choose your masters. Because whilst Bruce's eventual Wing Chun master, Ip Man, was easy to submit to as he was the teacher, it's Bruce's choice to call his neighborhood peer, William Cheng, that he learned what Wing Chun even was, even if it was a blow to his ego. And this is not the last time Bruce would deploy this strategy either. Like in the later relationship with Bruce Lee and the actor Steve McQueen, who would constantly have this power struggle with Bruce literally shaking his fist at McQueen's house, thinking himself to be one day a bigger star than McQueen. Very dramatic, I know. But, despite this, he still finds a way to be subservient to McQueen, saying that he could learn more about the ways of Hollywood acting by calling him his master in his mind. The modern Tai Chi martial artist Josh Waitskin refers to this as investment in loss in his book, which is excellent, by the way, called The Art of Learning. Waitskin actually notes that the idea is to invite ways of losing in order to recognize how to respond to them. That without having received certain kinds of loss, you won't know how to grow, you won't know how to improve. And for Waitskin, this meant allowing himself to take shots from the biggest, best in his dojo so that his body could build up resilience and learn how to absorb blows. And as a result, he stopped fearing the impact, allowing himself to be more relaxed, to slow himself down and sense when an attack was actually coming so that he can, move out of the way. And imagine if, Bruce Lee chose to avoid William Cheng in fear that he, would expose himself for being weaker in comparison. He would have never discovered Wing Chun. And as a matter of fact, it would have reaffirmed that the smart option is to always cower away, to not take on a bigger challenge that might make him look inferior in any way, which if he believed, then he would have never appeared in Hollywood at all. This is investment in loss. And whatever form that might take for you, it's worth dropping your pride and seeing where the opportunities to learn something could be. And if you're looking for a strategy that outlines exactly how you can best do this to find masters and make them your own, I actually did a whole episode for this podcast focused on what Ryan Holiday, the author, calls the canvas strategy, in which you'll learn how to best learn from those above you. So do look up that episode if you're looking for a strategy to help you that way. But the second lesson here lies in the result of investing in loss, which to Bruce was calmness. Something that, thanks to listening to his cornerman, of course, adopts in the second half of that fight. And with it came a victory, not too unlike the one that Josh Waitskin, who I just referenced, also found as an eventual Tai Chi Chuan champion. So whilst your instinct may be to create with furious energy and in intensity, which I often have as well, there is something more powerful in remaining calm. Josh Waitskin, again, has a great means of thinking about this. He actually calls it the soft zone, and I absolutely love this. Where most of us think that focusing requires us to be in the hard zone where you force yourself to concentrate, perhaps highly caffeinated as you do so, Waitskin makes a point that this is actually something that will make us more prone to being irritable and actually easily distractible, where, every noise or imperfect environment change can break you out of that state of concentration, rather than when you're in the soft zone where you're more open and relaxed and thus calmer. It's here where you're more likely to simply notice things without letting them jolt you out of focus. You simply notice, accept, and adjust, where, like a bamboo, you're firm, but you're able to bend with the wind. This is the style, of course, that Bruce Lee would later adopt, and whilst growing up, he is far from calm and in fact quite irritable. He soon allows the influence of this style of martial arts to enter his entire life strategy. And this is clearly evident as his demeanor changes most dramatically upon him turning 18. Because it's here that, at the point of becoming an adult, his parents actually decide to send their son to America on his own. Mind you, this was a decision not made lightly, and it does come to them as a result of multitude of reasons. Firstly, his fighting had gotten him into serious trouble. I mean, Bruce, having roughed up a teenager with powerful parents, actually caught the attention of the police now. Secondly, Bruce seemingly had no chance of attending one of Hong Kong's universities. In fact, it looked like he wouldn't even graduate high school, with his report card placing him ranked 41 out of 42 students, noticing his conduct to be very poor. And thirdly, having been born in America, this was his last chance to move there and register for a military draft in order to keep his US citizenship. But despite these reasons, Bruce still felt as though it was a punishment, like he was being sent away, exiled, banished, whatever you want to say. It didn't help that his father didn't see him off at the dock as Bruce made his way onto a one-way 18-day voyage on the SS President Wilson ocean liner to San Francisco. This was, by the way, due to an old custom that Ho Chen was upholding, which says that the father should never see their son off on a travel, but, it still impacted Bruce. And in the run-up to setting off, Bruce took this next adventure to be exactly that, an adventure, and began planning for it. After the resentment towards his parents having made this decision began to wear off, Bruce began to realize that he did in fact need a dramatic change of setting, and that this move would be a great opportunity for him to develop a more independent life. There's a journal entry where he actually wrote, "Now I try to find my career, whether as a doctor or another. If as a doctor, I must study hard." And whilst, by the way, this idea never comes to fruition, it forced Bruce to think about how he would financially support himself while he committed to such studies, especially considering he didn't want his father's financial support. And this is where he decides he would teach Wing Chun to American students. And anticipating this, Bruce sought to learn flashy kung fu styles that might impress and better market martial arts. The book notes one of his father's friends, Master Shiyu Hongsan, was an expert in Northern Kung Fu, known for its acrobatic leaps and high kicks. Bruce learned Northern style for showmanship. The deal was Master Sang would teach him fancy forms in return for Bruce instructing him in Cha-Cha. That's right, Bruce Lee, whilst fighting as a teacher, was also practicing Cha-Cha. Again, another thing I did not know about him. In fact, Bruce Lee actually became a national Cha-Cha champion. The book notes of all of his accomplishments as a youth, the boxing match, the challenge fight, the starring in movie roles. He was most proud of being, as he bragged to all of his friends for the rest of his life, the Cha-Cha champion of Hong Kong. And by the way, just as a side note, movie directors would later be impressed by Bruce's uniquely flowing martial arts movements, which very likely came from his background in Cha-Cha. But whilst these lessons exchanges were going on, Master Shiyu was developing his Cha-Cha very slowly, whilst Bruce Lee had quickly advanced in his practice of Northern Kung Fu. But with this new mentality to prepare as best as he could for his travels to America, he began to study even harder, which his parents were so confused by that it took actually a long conversation for them to see that Bruce was in fact actually maturing. Despite preparations almost being complete before finally leaving for America, Bruce had two impactful events that would occur that would set the stage for his creative career. Firstly, you would have a very profound encounter with the Taoist philosophy that I mentioned earlier that Ip Man was teaching alongside the techniques of Wing Chun. He would actually write about it in a college essay that he writes 2 years later. So I want to read you the encounter. He says, "About 4 years of hard training in the art of Kung Fu, I began to understand and felt the principles of gentleness, the art of neutralizing the effect of the opponent's effort and minimizing expenditure of one's energy. All of this must be done in calmness and without striving. It sounded simple, but in actual application, it was difficult. The moment I engaged in combat with an opponent, my mind was completely perturbed and unstable. Especially after a series of exchanging blows and kicks, all of my theory of gentleness was gone. My only thought left was somehow or another, I must beat him and win. My instructor, Professor Ip Man, would come to me and say, relax and calm your mind. Let your mind do the counter movement without any interfering deliberation. Above all, learn the art of detachment. That was it. I must relax. However, right there, I'd already done something contradictory against my will. That was when I said I must relax, the demand of effort in must was already inconsistent with the effortlessness in relax. When my acute self-consciousness grew to what psychologists would call double-blind, my instructor would again approach me and say, preserve yourself by following the natural bends of things and don't interfere. Remember to never be in frontal opposition to any problem, but control it by swinging with it. Don't practice this week. Go home and think about it. The following week, I stayed home after spending many hours in meditation and practice, and I gave up and went sailing alone in a junk. On the sea, I thought of all my past training and got mad at myself and punched at the water. Right there, at that moment, a thought suddenly struck me. Wasn't this water the essence of Kung Fu? I struck it just now, but it did not suffer hurt. Although it seemed weak, it could penetrate the hardest substance in the world. That was it. I wanted to be the nature of water. I lay on the boat and felt I had united with Tao. I'd become one with nature. The whole world to me was unitary. And with this profound experience comes an important lesson I think we can take away, just like Bruce Lee did himself. Whilst Bruce had an amazing intensity and desire to control or assert his will, this would also connected to the cause of his troubles and his problems. And in The Mind Explored, a newsletter written by my good friend and mental health doctor and founder, Dr. Manu Sidhu, Manu explores this idea of our greatest weaknesses being the exact opposite of our greatest strengths. The other equally sharp side of your double-edged sword. That for example, if we have a great strength that lies in our perseverance, we're also prone to the kind of stubbornness that prevents us from staying open enough to see more creative solutions to our problems, particularly considering that not all problems necessarily require pure, unadulterated perseverance. But in the same vein, Bruce Lee had the self-awareness to realize that he needed the lessons of Taoism and needed to let go in order to develop a sense of flow that realized ideas from a deeper, more authentic place. He effectively had to adopt Josh Waitzkin's soft zone. A second experience was that he would have one more film role before setting off that would become one of the best movie roles of his entire life. This is 9 years after playing the boy in My Son-A-Chang. He received his chance to play a leading role once again, having been offered only secondary parts up until that point. The film was called The Orphan. And remember how I just mentioned that Bruce learned the way to dance cha-cha? Whenever the schoolmaster in The Orphan tries to reach out to help him, Bruce's character would ignore him by breaking into an elaborate cha-cha routine. And remember when I said that, young Bruce pulled a knife on his teacher in class? Well, in The Orphan, Bruce's character does the very same thing. And it's in this scene that culminates in what the book describes as the most realistic fight scene of his career, when several of his classmates awkwardly try to wrestle the knife out of his hand, and they all end up falling over each other. Well, The Orphan becomes a critical and commercial success, and it becomes the first Hong Kong movie to break into the international market as it hits the Milan Film Festival. Teenagers in Hong Kong were so taken by Bruce's portrayal of his character that they began to copy his swagger, the way he smoked cigarettes, and even took up cha-cha dancing. So perhaps the lesson in this, and one that will reoccur again and again, is that Bruce was at his best acting-wise, fighting-wise, and just life-wise when he could channel what made him unique. So in whatever you do, let it be a reflection of all that makes you unique. And like Bruce with his cha-cha and his fighting, let it be a combination that surprises people as well. If you like, and more accurately, are good at two completely different things, lean into that. As the more disconnected they are, the more unique it will make you and whatever you create. Because it's the confidence that this decision portrays that will draw people in. Finally, on the afternoon of April 29th, 1959, Bruce left for America, where on the dock, he promised his mother he would behave and only to return when he made himself some money. Once Bruce made it to America, he quickly found work as a waiter in a Chinese restaurant. But having only ever worked as an actor until that point, and considering his natural inclinations regarding servitude, Bruce only lasts a week. So he quickly moved to making his money from teaching, as he intended, but not for Kung Fu. In fact, he does so from Cha-Cha. Bruce had a natural knack for teaching, where his charm and ability to demonstrate talent on demand came in handy. Full of energy during the breaks between Cha-Cha classes, Bruce would actually perform his Wing Chun skills, which particularly stunned a student named George Lee, a 40-year-old, who asked Bruce what style he was performing. He said, "I've been training in Kung Fu for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like you're doing. What are your plans?" Bruce explained he would be moving to Seattle for school after the summer. "When you're back this way, I'd like to get a group and have you as our instructor." In Seattle, Bruce attended Edison Technical High School and actually did very well. He even graduated in 18 months. But his biggest development during this time came in his martial arts. Within the first few months, he began to realize that if he were to return to Hong Kong, it'd be difficult to compete on the same level as those who stayed in Hong Kong, of course, and continue to learn and develop their Wing Chun technique. So, with there being no teacher for the obscure Wing Chun method in Seattle, Bruce sought to learn as many different techniques as possible, eyeing up the idea that he'd be able to combine them in some kind of super system, something he believed that would make him the greatest martial artist in the world. No small ambitions we can note here. Soon, Bruce had his very first public performance in America at the Seattle Sea Fair. Interestingly, Bruce's first performance was with a female partner as they cha-cha together. But then, in stark contrast, his following performance displayed the southern praying mantis form, filled with intricate hand movements. And in the audience was a young and wide-eyed African-American man named Jesse Glover. And Jesse ends up becoming a very important figure in Bruce Lee's life. As the book notes, growing up in Seattle, Jesse became obsessed with martial arts after a drunken, racist cop shattered his jaw with a nightstick. Jesse wanted revenge, but he couldn't find any Asian instructor who would teach a black teenager. That was until he met Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee officially took on Jesse Glover as his first ever Kung Fu student. And this isn't just a big deal in Bruce Lee's personal life. This is a huge deal in Kung Fu in general. I mean, in fact, Kung Fu up until this point had been prohibited from being taught to anyone non-Chinese. Heck, even Bruce Lee himself nearly got kicked out of Ip Man's class when the teachers discovered he was not fully Chinese by blood. The unwritten century rule here is sat on a simple yet untested question. Why share your secret weapon with potential enemies? And, trust Never Sit Still to operate against this rule. Well, Never Sit Still taught Jesse at his school, first in secret actually at Jesse's house. But soon enough, Jesse became Bruce's best PR agent. He couldn't stop talking about how great his new teacher was. And pretty soon, Bruce had several potential students asking him if he could teach them. So in 1963, whilst in college, Bruce opened the Junfan Kung Fu Institute. And the significance of this to Bruce Lee himself cannot be understated because when we talk about ambition, in a letter he wrote to his former sweetheart, Bruce Lee outlines a kind of mission statement for his life that I love. And I just have to read you a bit of this. It says, "My aim is to establish a first Kung Fu institute that will spread all over the US. I have set my time limit of 10 to 15 years to complete this whole project. My reason in doing so is not the sole objective of making money. The motives are many, and among them are, I'd like to let the world know about the greatness of this Chinese art. I enjoy teaching and helping people. I like to have a well-to-do home for my family. I like to originate something. And last, but yet one of the most important, is because Kung Fu is a part of myself. I feel like I have this great, creative, and spiritual force within me that is greater than faith, greater than ambition, greater than confidence, greater than determination, greater than vision. It is all of these combined. I may now own nothing but a little place down in the basement, but once my imagination has got up to full head of steam, I can see painted on a canvas of my mind a picture of a fine, big 5 or 6-story Kung Fu institute with branches all over the States." I absolutely love this, particularly in that he doesn't dismiss his imagination as being delusional or impossible like most of us would, but rather sees it as his mind showing him the path. And to me, this part where Bruce says, I feel I have this great creative and spiritual force within me is, to me, what being inspired is. After all, the Latin word inspired literally means something from outside breathing within us. I absolutely love this letter. Of course, Bruce Lee initially taught his students Chinese Kung Fu, convinced of its superiority. But the funny thing is that the sheer size of these American students had him rethinking his approach almost immediately. He realized that the same techniques that worked on young Chinese men at Ip Man School weren't going to work on opponents that were 8 inches taller and 100 pounds heavier. He actually had to expand his practice wider. And in doing so, discovered the value of certain judo throws and chokes, and came to appreciate the power of Western boxing's punches and fluidity of footwork. Of course, Bruce Lee would still consider himself to be a kung fu practitioner, but he had begun to do something very important. He had begun to adapt and mold his style like water and began to mix the East with the West. So there are two quick lessons I want to note here. First is the impact that Bruce had by teaching Jesse Glover. By focusing on one person, a person that would have never been accepted by any kung fu school until then, and affecting that person greatly, he actually made a super fan out of his student. And there is something in focusing your efforts entirely on one audience member you have in mind. Hell, I have one for this very podcast right now, but rather than trying to adapt to bring on the masses. And in fact, James Joyce, the writer, says that in the particular is contained the universal. And this is why technologist Kevin Kelly talks and advises artists to only focus on getting 1,000 true fans. That's 1,000, not 1,000,000 or more than you may think you need, but 1,000. And that with those 1,000 true fans, you can make a meaningful living from your art, not the millions you might think you need. The second lesson is that of being open to mixing and infusing your styles. The quote that I've actually noted here is actually one that comes from the Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, who would advise us to never be attached to one style. He actually says, you should not have any special fondness for a particular weapon, or anything else for that matter. Too much of the same is the same. It's not enough. Without imitating anyone else, you should have as much weaponry as suits you. And it's clear that Bruce Lee did this with his approach to martial arts. Whilst, all those around him found their identity baked in being the master of one style. But even for us, we can opt to remain open, to not limit ourselves by calling ourselves writers, illustrators. That's why I like the word maker, because maker suggests you create, but it doesn't specify how. Just like Bruce Lee would use martial arts, but not specify which one. Bruce's teachings of Kung Fu led him to meet some people who changed his life. And this is more than just Jesse Glover. One such significant meeting for Bruce came following a demonstration he did whilst on tour with a film production, having actually been a cha-cha dance partner to the lead actress. I need to stop laughing when I mention cha-cha. I just laugh because I'm always surprised that that's a big influence in his life, considering we never talk about it when we talk about Bruce Lee. But it's not a laughing matter because actually, because of exactly that, the impact that it has, it's so significant and again, speaks to his fluidity and mixing of different skills. But at each stop of the tour, the organizers had allowed Bruce to do a Wing Chun demonstration. Of course, Bruce would do more than demonstrate moves, as he would actually lecture the crowds with his thoughts on martial arts styles, openly criticizing them in the process. One stop was in San Francisco's Chinatown, where Bruce anticipated to be greeted with a hostile audience who had caught wind of his lecture talking points. So he decided to end his demonstration there by making a bold, open statement. He says, I would like to let everyone know that any time my Chinatown brothers want to research my Wing Chun, they are more than welcome to find me at my school in Oakland. For anyone who's in martial arts, they would know that these kind of challenges were actually in part to recruit students to his school, but he did also genuinely believe that there were issues with the other martial arts styles, and that his Wing Chun method was better. And his invitation to inspect this caused insult. That led one such practitioner, David Chin, to demand action against Bruce and recruited Wong Jack Mun. Wong Jack Mun was a professional martial arts practitioner who was keen to open up his school and use this moment as an opportunity to draw attention toward the opening of that school. Unlike Bruce, who was a modernist adapting different styles, maintaining Wing Chun as his base art, Wong Jack Man was a traditionalist who strictly practiced the art of Northern Shaolin Kung Fu. A fight eventually ensued between the two of them, and whilst it was supposed to be a friendly sparring match, it quickly became more violent and aggressive. Bruce, who was fighting in a white tank top and jeans, quickly attacked within the first few seconds of his fight with Wong Jack Man, who, to contrast, was wearing a traditional black kung fu uniform with long sleeves and flowing trousers. Now, Wong Jack Man would go on to claim that this attack occurred as he attempted to shake Bruce's hand, which reinforces the friendly nature of the initial intent for this fight, but it's hard for him to claim that his intentions were completely friendly, as further into the fight, after at first having run away from Bruce's heavy blows, he revealed to have had strapped on a pair of leather wrist bracelets studded with metal spikes, something he used as he karate chopped at Bruce's neck, which could have been fatal. Of course, secret weapons like this were strictly forbidden from such fights, but no one noticed that he had them as he covered them with his long sleeves, so even his attire choice really came from trying to conceal and be deceitful. The entire fight lasted 3 minutes, which was very unusual for Bruce, whose short burst style attacks usually meant he defeated his opponents within the first 10 seconds of the fight, but it ended with Wong Jack-man on the defensive, having tripped on a raised platform, making him crash into the window behind him. Bruce then jumped, leapt on top of Wong, and rained down punches while shouting, "Yield! Give up!" David Chin, the man who was most insulted by Bruce Lee's initial challenge and had organized the fight, jumped in and stopped the fight. And whilst those across Chinatown would call this a win in Bruce's favor, as the book notes, for Bruce, an ugly win was almost as bad as a defeat. And for the first time, he felt that perhaps this was due to his own style of martial arts. Bruce Lee later told one of his friends, "It really bugged me after the fight. It was the first time I felt something wrong in the way I was fighting. The fight took too long and I didn't know what to do when he ran. Getting my fist bruised from punching the other guy's head was kind of stupid. I knew right then I had to do something about my fighting." And again, as the book notes, for years he had preached that the individual was more important than the style. After his ugly win, he finally accepted the truth for himself. Meeting Wong Jack-man and David Chin also led Bruce to begin questioning his own career goals. No longer did he want the kind of negative attention and enemies that his ambitions had caused, and he began to wonder if he really wanted to spend the rest of his life teaching martial arts. Another very significant person that I have to mention that Bruce meets is that of Linda Emery, who in 1964 would become Linda Lee as Bruce and Linda married, giving Bruce a wife who would describe her ability to provide, never sit still, with repose, tranquility, understanding, and true love. It's also worth noting that at the time that they married, both of them had dropped out of college and had a baby on the way and barely had a dime between them. Which I mention because this is also what likely had Bruce thinking bigger and beyond martial arts. One of Bruce Lee's top students and closest friends, Taki Kamura, who I wish I could speak to more. It's worth learning about him through the book, but for the sake of the brevity of this podcast, I pulled this one quote where he says, "Nobody has ever given Linda the credit she deserves. This woman has been one hell of a pillar of strength. I don't think Bruce would have aspired to the heights that he did without her support." But there was one more significant meeting Bruce had, and this was the hairstylist Jay Sebring. Remember Jay Sebring? I mentioned him in the intro of this podcast because he was the one who suggested that a client of his, William Dozier, should consider Bruce Lee to be the star of his new production. Jay Sebring had seen and somehow gotten hold of a video of one of Bruce's infamous demonstrations, and Dozier was impressed and immediately demanded that Bruce come to his office at 20th Century Fox to do a screen test for him. And this screen test took place in LA on February 4th, 1964, which is significant because it's only 3 days after his son Brandon was born in East Oakland Hospital, which meant that Bruce jumped on a flight to seize this opportunity almost immediately after his wife had given birth to his son. As Linda put it, Bruce was super dad, but he was not the kind who changed diapers and got up in the middle of the night. He had weightier things on his mind, like building a career and paying the bills. Despite being a sleep-deprived new father, Bruce was ready. And in a screen test that you can still watch on YouTube, Never Sit Still sat still and looked into the camera while he introduced himself to Hollywood. "My last name is Lee, Bruce Lee." He then goes on to talk about Kung Fu, describing it to be like a glass of water, and before long he's demonstrating those Kung Fu moves with a slightly scared assistant director as a stand-in opponent, and even just his interaction with him shows his teaching as well. This whole screen test is a joy to watch. I mean, it's really, really worth taking the time to watch it. It's not that long, and admittedly it's not the full Bruce Lee that we later see in his films, as he's a little bit held back and he's fidgety at the beginning of the video, but by the end of the video, his charisma, charm, and skills are all on display. And most Bruce Lee of all, he seems to be enjoying himself. I think this time around the screen test marks a very important time for Bruce, and it's partly why I talked about it at the beginning of the podcast, because not only was Bruce's first child, Brandon, born 3 days before the screen test, not only was the screen test effectively the beginning of what would launch his career in Hollywood, but 3 days following the screen test, Bruce Lee's father, Hui Chun, passed away. He died with a weakened heart and lung, something he'd possessed following years of smoking opium. Sigmund Freud, the psychologist, would say father's death is the most important event, the most heartbreaking and poignant loss in a man's life. And, some modern psychologists have analyzed this to be because it's the first time a man is seen to have no barrier between himself and the unknown. Well, the impact, whilst great, was probably not as shocking as Freud suggests, considering that Bruce had faced the unknown since he first left for America and was by now very familiar with it. This unknown would continue, however, as the screen test, whilst resulting in Dozier signing Bruce to an exclusive contract, one that paid him so much they actually decided to shut down the school in Oakland. No project would actually come as a result for this for a few years. But Bruce didn't waste this time, and he would use it to obsess over the details of his ugly fight where he believed Wing Chun to have failed him. He would actually write to his friend Taki Kimura, "My mind is made up to start a new system of my own. I mean a system of totality, embracing awe, but yet guided with simplicity." He would use this time to read through his library of books, mostly on boxing and fencing, which was a sport that his brother was great at, but also philosophy, looking for inspiration. He also watched 16mm films of boxers like Jack Dempsey and Cassius Clay, who's obviously known to us now as Muhammad Ali. And by the end of February 1966, Dozier submits his first draft for Charlie Chan's Number One Son, a project that he was keen for Bruce to play the lead in. But a few weeks later, ABC rejects the project. And I note this as important, and the book notes this because it's unknown exactly why, although not hard to guess. No TV executive in 1966 was willing to risk their job by greenlighting a show starring a completely unknown Chinese actor. Obviously, this is a huge blow to Bruce Lee and delays the appearance of this Asian male idol. But that said, Bruce Lee's connection with Dozier would not end here. And William Dozier, who was hedging his bets as a producer, he had Number One Son as his big focus, but he also had other projects in various stages of development to present to the TV executives. The book notes, his strategy was to buy up all the TV rights to various comic book, radio, and literary properties, including, of course, Charlie Chan, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Dick Tracy. I think most of us will know that Dozier's Batman was a great success because the 1966 TV phenomenon had Batman played by Adam West on the cover of Life magazine with the headline, "The whole country goes super mad" above him. But perhaps fewer people will know about Dozier's parallel show, The Green Hornet. Originally a radio drama, The Green Hornet's premise had Britt Reed, a millionaire who acted as a newspaper publisher by day, but a masked crime fighter known as the Green Hornet by night. Sound kind of familiar? Whilst Batman had Robin, the Green Hornet also had a sidekick that became actually more popular than the hero himself. Bruce Lee still remained under the contract with Dozier, so when Number One Son fell through, Lee was offered the role of Kato. And Kato is written to be more of a human weapon to Green Hornet than a strategic partner like Robin was to Batman. And whilst he is relegated to effectively being a subservient butler and driver to Britt Reed when they're not fighting crime, which is a bit odd to watch, to be honest, given the nature of the relationship between Batman and Robin, it didn't matter because what Bruce Lee did with his limited role was phenomenal. Firstly, this was the first chance for American audiences to see Chinese Kung Fu on national TV, a chance for Lee to showcase his skills. And in fact, most action scenes that feature both Green Hornet and Kato fighting alongside each other, Kato actually makes the Green Hornet look pretty unintimidating, unlike perhaps the dynamic between Batman and Robin, where
Robin is the greener, naive character that makes Batman look more mature by comparison. And living up to his first nickname, Bruce Lee never sat still. And on set, whilst the rest of the cast would wait for their moment on camera, Bruce would perform stunts. In fact, he would go on to do this in waiting times on set throughout his production, something that Tarantino does poke fun at in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, something I have to mention at least once in this podcast. There's a moment where Bruce Lee commands the attending of all the stuntmen who sit and stand around him taking a break waiting for their next scene. These so-called stunts were not just break time for Lee, because during filming, Lee would actually insist on taking the action to another gear. At that point in Hollywood, punches were shown in the John Wayne style, which is basically where the camera would sit held over a stuntman's shoulder so the main actor could stand 3 feet away and swing in the air. As long as the stuntman actor sold his reaction well and good sound effect was added in post, they could actually have a convincing punch. All the stuntmen on the Green Hornet were trained and expected to perform in this manner, but Bruce Lee insisted on close quarters combat. Having only performed his moves on stage in 3D space as opposed to 2D space, Bruce Lee was most experienced in fighting in a way that can look realistic when viewed from every angle. In doing so, Bruce Lee actually ended up striking many of his stuntmen accidentally, of course. He'd do this so fast that stuntmen didn't even know whether to say they hurt their jaws or their stomachs. And in any case, a lot of stuntmen didn't want to work on the shoot anymore. And this is the most controversial part, I think, of Bruce Lee's depiction in Tarantino's movie, because fans of Bruce Lee were gutted to see Bruce Lee to be arrogant and almost unlikable. But the sour nature amongst the American stuntmen was likely accurate. And whilst there is a potential misrepresentation of Bruce Lee's means of interacting with others on set, it's worth remembering that Tarantino is a huge fan of Bruce Lee and very obviously references Bruce Lee's films in his own filmography, particularly in that of Kill Bill. So, he is going to have spent the time to get to know Bruce Lee. Ultimately, though, it's undeniable that Bruce Lee's Kato had a huge impact. And again, this was the first time that Chinese Kung Fu was being shown in an American TV show. His characters received fan mails from American children more than the lead of the show ever did. And most importantly, as the book notes, Bruce and Kato were embraced by a small but growing American martial arts community who had never seen their art performed on screen by one of their own. Overnight, Bruce Lee became the most famous martial artist in the country, with profiles and invitations to headline karate tournaments. Thing is, Bruce Lee's deal with the studio was not great, and some might see this bad deal that, put him in a less financially, lucrative position, let's say, or, even the fact that his character is given very few lines and was ultimately a manservant to the Green Hornet. People might see this stuff, but you have to recognize that Bruce never had the leverage nor the precedent to lean on. I mean, if Bruce Lee demanded more pay at this point, or demanded more screen time, or even dialogue, the studio would have easily replaced him with a non-Asian actor for that matter, as it was already considered a risk to have such a prominent character played by an Asian actor at the time. So instead, Bruce learned to work with what was available, but he did the very best he could and resulted in his character and him having a tremendous impact. So the lesson here is you too might find yourself wishing for better circumstances. But if this is the case, be honest with yourself. How much leverage do you actually have in the situation? Because if it's a lot and you aren't deluding yourself in the degree to which you are irreplaceable, then go for it. Ask for more, considering that you have more room to do so. But if you don't have a lot, then ask yourself, what can you do with the opportunity, with what you have? Do as Christopher Nolan did when he made his first feature film with the $6,000, not the millions, but the $6,000 he saved up from his day job, rather than demanding and waiting for those millions in production budget before he started creating. Unfortunately, unlike Batman, the Green Hornet was not renewed after its first season. Bruce Lee was very gracious, and he thanked Dozier for the opportunity by saying, "I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you personally for all that you've done to start my career in show business. Without you, I would have never thought about being in Hollywood. My attitude in this business is to take things as they are and to look up to the sky with feet firmly solid on the ground." And that he'd have to, as he was now without acting work. And there were some other ways he could still garner an income. For example, thanks to the popularity of playing Kato, he could actually make paid appearances across the country. This would include him appearing at fairs, malls, and openings of stores, usually dressed in his dark suit, chauffeur's cap, and black mask. But these appearances were few and far between and wouldn't provide the reliable income he needed to sustain a family and continue to live in Los Angeles. That's when the idea to open a nationwide franchise of Kato karate schools was floated to Bruce by several businessmen keen to capitalize on, his character's popularity, especially amongst the young who wanted to arm themselves with the skills that Kato displayed on TV each week. They would fund it, and he would put his name, expertise, and prestige to the schools. This would give him his college dream all at once, not in the 10 to 15 year span he first mentioned to his high school sweetheart that he'd given himself, but it just didn't sit right with Bruce. The idea went against everything he'd grown to believe about martial arts since he first started fighting. He came to believe that martial arts was supposed to be, as the book perfectly articulates, the physical expression of one's individuality in combat, not the hamburgers to homogenize for mass consumption. From the uniforms to the uniform curriculum, Bruce hated everything about karate McDojos. He only liked to teach small groups of highly talented and motivated students, mostly so that they could help him get better too. So instead, soon after the Green Hornet finished filming, Bruce opened a branch of his Chun Kung Fu Institute in the LA Chinatown. Bruce conceived of his LA branch more as an executive private club than a commercial school. New students had to be sponsored by an existing member, and the first 6 months were a tryout. And this probably doesn't mean for the student to like the class, but really to see if Bruce liked you. What these students were unlikely to realize is how many innovations Bruce would bring here at the LA branch to the art of martial arts. Firstly, Bruce was the first martial artist to introduce protective gear like boxing gloves, headgear, and shin guards to practice. Until then, most students in dojos across America would stop their punches an inch before making contact. But Bruce believed that this style of practice was both unrealistic and wasteful. He called it swimming on dry land, and so insisted on full contact. But secondly, Bruce was also keen only to have students to learn from. It also meant that sometimes his lessons weren't really lessons. In fact, knowing this, Bruce would often refuse to take payment, as he felt that he'd spent so much of the session practicing himself than teaching. He was doing a lot of this, particularly at this time, because he was secretly developing a brand new style of martial arts, a style he'd eventually call Jeet Kune Do. This is a Cantonese name for the martial arts, which translates to stop fist way, also known as the way of the intercepting fist. What a great name. Bruce explained the broad strokes of Jeet Kune Do as follows. There are 3 opportunities to strike an opponent: before he attacks, during his attack, or after he attacks. Jeet Kune Do means the interception before he attacks, to intercept his movements, his thoughts, or his motive. Bruce has also explained why he was forced to create this entirely new style in order to achieve this. He says, you have to go outside your environment to achieve something better. People will say, hey, that's a Korean kick. We can't use that kick. But I don't care. It belongs to mankind. Bruce invented his martial arts by taking all that he'd studied, learned, and used in real fights to make what he believed to be the most realistic, effective way of fighting. For example, from boxing, he took the superior footwork, naturally inspired by Muhammad Ali's footwork. From Kung Fu, he took the kicks. He also took the stance and movements from fencing. As the book notes, unlike boxers who place their weak side forward, Bruce used an on-guard position, strong side crouching forward, right hand extended as if he was holding a sword, and left heel raised and cocked to explode off the blocks when bridging the gap. This approach of taking all these styles in different forms reminds me of the book Steal Like an Artist by an amazing author, Austin Kleon, who notes in his book, and I've noted it down here, the artist is a collector, not a hoarder. Mind you, there's a difference. Hoarders collect indiscriminately. Artists collect selectively. They only collect the things they really love. And that's exactly what Bruce Lee did to create his art. He cherry-picked what worked, and he disposed of what didn't, never held back by tradition or feeling precious because he once loved a style like that of Wing Chun. In the book Made to Stick by Dan and Chip Heath, the writers note that the defining trait of an artist is the individual expression. this is definitely the case with Bruce's new style. Even the book points that out. It says, Jeet Kune Do was Bruce's personal expression of the martial arts. Like a custom-made suit, it tailored to take advantage of his innate aggressiveness, his reflexes, and uncanny ability to read an opponent. But you may hear this and think, wait a minute, if Jeet Kune Do was an expression of Bruce's own style, then if taught to others, how could it possibly stand up to the scrutiny of Bruce's ideals that the martial art should adapt to the individual and should be an expression of the individual, rather than for the individual to learn? Surely Jeet Kune Do was another style that people had to learn, like all of those that Bruce had shunned himself away from. That's where Bruce's own words would come into handy, as the book notes that whilst Jeet Kune Do was his personal system, his students needed to follow their own path. He was simply a guide, not a teacher. As he notes, Jeet Kune Do is merely a name used, a boat to get across the river. Once across, it is to be discarded and not carried on one's own back. Like that of the paradoxical nature of Zen writing, the kind that you'd find in Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, Bruce called Jeet Kune Do the style of no style and made his school slogan using no way as way, having no limitation as limitation. And I'll quote Josh Waitzkin again, who described this phenomenon of deep and continuous deliberate practice as a process of studying numbers to leave numbers. That by studying a chessboard and all of its intricate yet possible moves, you can eventually arrive at a place where you no longer think about the detail of the moves or the pieces, but rather zoom out to see the entire play at once, almost subconsciously. This is likely what Bruce was advocating with his new style of martial arts. So I think you can see why he didn't take the opportunity to cheapen his art and simply have it commercialized as Kato's karate schools, which would have literally, held the art to the form of martial arts of karate, a form that Bruce himself had long left behind at this point, and would have been about helping students become like the fictional character rather than it being a means to find your own talents brought forward by martial arts. It'd be 4 years until Bruce had the same kind of impactful acting gig in Hollywood again since playing Kato, although he did star in TV shows like Ironside, Blondie, Here Comes the Bride, and the movie Marlowe as minor characters. However, again, not wasting any time and keeping his time alive as Robert Greene, the author, would advise us to do with downtime. Since playing Kato, Bruce has developed Jeet Kune Do, as I had mentioned, but he also, taken on many celebrity clients to train under him, which included basketballer Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who Bruce imagined when training with him how cool it would be if the two of them would ever fight on screen for a 5'7.5" kung fu Hong Kong man to fight a man over 7 foot tall. He also trained the actor Steve McQueen, directors like Blake Edwards, who directed Breakfast at Tiffany's and The Pink Panther, and Roman Polanski, who directed Chinatown. And most notably, actress Sharon Tate, which you'd likely recognize the name of, as she, along with Jay Sebring, the hairstylist I mentioned earlier, were actually murdered along with Tate's unborn baby and 3 other friends by the infamous Manson cult followers, a particularly dark time in Hollywood towards the end of the 1960s, and something that Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that I mentioned earlier also speaks to. Well, despite that, the most consequential celebrity he trained was that of Steven Silliphant, who was considered as one of the best working screenwriters at the time. I mean, Steven Silliphant and Bruce were close and even attempted to write a screenplay known as The Silent Flute, which was Bruce's attempt to produce his own kung fu Hollywood movie, a film that actually he wanted Steve McQueen to star in. But Steve McQueen refused, and eventually the project fell through. But the script was not the last time Silliphant and Lee would work together. Despite Bruce's frustrations, mostly due to the fact that no studio yet was ready to take the risk of having an Asian leading man in a film focused primarily on kung fu, Silliphant actually devised a new strategy to make Bruce Lee a movie star. He imagined that if he was able to help get Bruce Lee a TV show, that would help him make him less of a risk to movie studios. That said, Silliphant didn't believe that Bruce Lee was yet ready to actually carry an entire project. Whilst he recognized that Bruce had the charisma and energy of a potential star, that magnetism hadn't quite manifested on screen yet. As the book notes, Kato was bland, his acting in Marlowe was stiff. Bruce needed the right vehicle. He also needed to dig deeper as an actor. He needed a breakout performance. That's when the head of Paramount TV hired Silliphant to adapt a series of mystery novels about a blind private investigator who solved murders. That show would be called Longstreet. And while Silliphant didn't write Bruce Lee to play the lead, he had him play an even better role. Effectively, Bruce Lee was to play Bruce Lee. Silliphant had written the third episode of Longstreet to be dedicated to Bruce and his personal style of martial arts. Even the episode's title is actually The Way of the Intercepting Fist. Bruce would play Li Tsung, an antique dealer and kung fu master who would end up teaching the main character, Mike Longstreet, the art of kung fu. Not only did Silliphant lay Bruce up with an episode and character that he could shine in, but as the book notes, he had a blast with writing the dialogue too. Silliphant said, "What I did was simply take the many things Bruce had taught me and put them into the script. He turned the private martial arts lessons he had taken in his free time into material." I love that. And the influence is obvious with lines that echo now what we know Bruce Lee had to learn himself. Like, "You had a quarrelsome mind, Mr. Longstreet. Unless you learn to calm it, you will never hear the outside world." When examining the lore around Bruce Lee, there's actually a big misunderstanding about a quote that people gravitate to and attribute to Bruce Lee. I think this is particularly important, actually, because in the episode, Longstreet wants to have a challenge match, and Li Tsung, Bruce Lee's character, agrees to help prepare him. I read from the book as it describes this misunderstanding very well. The book says, as the day approaches, Longstreet desperately tries to cram years of self-defense training into a few hours. When he complains that there's too much for him to remember, Li Tsung delivers Bruce Lee's most famous line.
"If you try to remember, you will lose. Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. Put it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or creep or drip or crash. Be water, my friend."
Over the years, this passage has become every Bruce Lee fan's favorite saying. But after Longstreet aired, Bruce did a television interview with Pierre Berton, Canada's top TV journalist. And since it's the only TV interview with Lee that still exists, every Bruce Lee documentary uses clips from it. And during their chat, Berton asks Bruce, "Can you remember the key lines by Sterling Silliphant? You wrote there are some lines that express your philosophy. I don't know if you remember them or not." Bruce replies, "Oh, I remember them. I said empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water," and so on.
Be water, my friend.
And then even ends by saying, "Like that, you see?" But since then, every Bruce Lee documentary edits out Burton's prompting and presents the portion where Bruce is saying empty your mind, as if it were a Zen mystic and not an actor quoting a line written by an Oscar-winning screenwriter. So what's effectively the most famous quote of Bruce Lee was actually him quoting dialogue written by Sterling Silliphant, proof that he really was likely one of the best screenwriters working at the time. But again, it might be his writing, and this is obviously the surprising part, but it echoes Bruce Lee's teachings, and it really is very much inspired by who Bruce Lee is, which is why he's so able to perfectly recall, I think, the quote in a live interview. You know, some actors become icons when they're given a breakout role that really allows them to transform themselves. You know, obviously I'm thinking of people like Christian Bale in American Psycho, or, you know, say Matthew McConaughey in Dallas Buyers Club. But Bruce Lee needed something where his already star-like personality could be seen. Where, like his belief of how martial arts should be a reflection of the individual, he didn't need a character for him to learn and become. He needed a role that reflected the man he already was. You know, the impact had to come from who he was. And the impact of this character was immense and gearing him up to be the lead star that Silliphant was setting him up to be. The public loved him, and the New York Times review even endorsed him to have his own TV show. And yet, this is not the domain that Bruce would tackle next. And in fact, he would not even remain in America, as now Hong Kong was calling once again. Bruce visited Hong Kong in 1970 on a short trip with the purpose of getting his mother a visa to live with him in America. But when he exited the plane, he was shocked by what awaited him. There was a huge gathering of reporters. Many photos were taken and many interviews were conducted immediately upon Bruce's arrival. What Bruce hadn't realized at that moment was that the Green Hornet had recently aired on the Hong Kong TV and had become so popular amongst the locals that it was nicknamed the Kato Show. Bruce Lee was a star in the way that he wanted to be in Hollywood, except in the place where he was first an actor. So within a year of his newfound fame, a deal was struck between Bruce Lee and the then king of Hong Kong movie production, Raymond Chow of Golden Harvest Production Company. And any fans of Chinese martial arts films would immediately recognize that name as really the godfather of that era. He signed Bruce Lee to make two films, The Big Boss and Fist of Fury. But despite this, Bruce was not exactly optimistic because before signing the contract, he prepared by watching a series of Hong Kong kung fu films, movies that he noted, saying here in the book that they were awful. It is impossible to act and fight at the same time, but most Chinese films have been very superficial and one-dimensional. So ultimately, it was the financial pressure that Bruce was under at the time to provide for his wife and son that made him take the deal, not that he was inspired. That said, these two films are truly the beginning of what we know as Bruce Lee in full form. This is the Bruce Lee that you know when I mention his name. And it's really on full display here. The Big Boss is great and it has a huge impact as it breaks all kinds of box office records. But Fist of Fury, I think, is where Bruce Lee truly steps into dominance. And if you're going to watch any Bruce Lee film back from this era, it has to be Fist of Fury. It's the film where he first introduced the nunchuck to the world of cinema, a weapon that you cannot disassociate from Bruce Lee now. I mean, the two have basically become a pair, right? And it's with this weapon in hand that Bruce would have one of the greatest martial art impacts ever. I mean, the first scene where he reveals the weapon, Bruce is in a karate dojo and faces off with 20 plus guys, one of which being a little known stuntman known by the name of Jackie Chan. Yes. But this scene is incredible and it's probably one of my favorite action scenes across Bruce Lee's entire filmography. It shows Bruce's athleticism, his dynamic nature, his mastery of weapons, and by showing him take on so many opponents on his own, by the way, it cemented Bruce Lee as the ideal power fantasy. I mean, to be able to take out all enemies on your own like that. I mean, I kid you not. I recently even met a guy at my local swimming pool, a guy in his 40s. I saw him initially doing all sorts of strange looking, martial arts moves in the pool. It was like a ball of energy that needed to be expended before heading into the sauna. So when I actually then found myself in the sauna at the same time as him, I asked him about his moves, wondering if he was training for something. And he actually revealed to me that he'd been in the army in Iran, but, and these were just exercise regiments that he'd kind of kept since those days. But before long, I sneakily dropped Bruce Lee into our conversation just to see his reaction. And as I expected, his face lit up. From that point, he couldn't stop talking about how important that name was to him. I mean, he idolized the man like he was responsible for everything good in his life. This man had seen growing up and that excitement had never left him. So we both spoke at length about the impact of that scene, even though neither of us could actually recall where it sat in which film. The scene's impact was still significant. I'll also note that Fist of Fury is also an obvious inspiration for Kill Bill, which is Quentin Tarantino's film that I mentioned earlier, where you can see the final fight in both Fist of Fury and Kill Bill Part 1. They both take place in very similar locations. But whilst Bruce Lee was capitalizing on his newfound fame in Hong Kong, a new energy was bubbling back in America. See, as Bruce Lee was filming The Big Boss, Paramount was preparing to release the first 4 episodes of Longstreet that it filmed onto the American public. And whilst the original order had Bruce Lee's appearance in The Way of the Intercepting Fist episode to appear as episode 3, the then head of Paramount loved the episode so much that he decided to make it a season opener. But of course, this raised a problem for Paramount because they were going to open a show with this new charismatic teacher, and yet he was not going to appear in the rest of the show. So Paramount worked hard to get a multi-episode deal in front of Bruce Lee. And their initial offer for this, by the way, was $1,000 per episode. But finally, Bruce Lee had the leverage he always wanted and instead asked and got $2,000 per episode for 3 episodes, and that Bruce would only be required on set for a maximum of 9 days. The book also notes that all these telegrams and telephone requests from Paramount to the offices of Raymond Chow's Golden Harvest also had this side benefit of transforming Bruce in Raymond Chow's eyes as a Hollywood star. So Bruce Lee does go back to Hollywood to film those 3 extra episodes of Longstreet. But it's worth remembering the role that he was playing. He was not the heroic main character savior who could take on an entire group of enemies like he could in his Hong Kong films. In Longstreet, he was still a manservant again to a rich white man. He effectively had no role in the plot beyond giving Longstreet some wise words whilst holding a punching bag. But again, it didn't matter, because when the show finally aired, the New York Times had published a review that Bruce proudly quoted to his friend. It said, "The Chinaman incidentally came off quite convincingly enough to earn himself a television series." And Stephen Silliphant also noted at the time that all the fan mail for the show was coming in for Bruce. As the book puts it, Bruce was done with the show, but it served its purpose. The pilot had grabbed the attention of the American public and earned him the endorsement from the New York Times for his own TV show. Raymond Chow, seeing Bruce's mounting fame and stardom, naturally wanted to capitalize on this and proposed for Bruce to star in a 3rd film under their production company. However, Bruce was not keen on working with the director for The Big Boss and Fist of Fury again, a man named Lo Wei. The 2 of them had many disagreements on set. But frustrating Bruce more, Lo Wei had been telling people that after the film's release that he was directly responsible for Bruce's success. So in an effort to make sure that Bruce's future success could be more directly measured by his own efforts, Bruce proposed to Raymond Chow that he would write, direct, and star in his own movie. Moreover, he would even compose the music himself. This reminds me of Charlie Chaplin, who did all of the above for the majority of his films. And, these are both men who believe that if you want something done well, you better do it yourself. You can be the judge of when that's the best approach or not. But Bruce wrote his first screenplay by dictating his ideas into a tape recorder. And this is a lesson I've advised here on the podcast before, but if you want to write quickly and well, you want to be clear in your own mind about what you have to write, then you definitely benefit from speaking your ideas aloud. So, give your friend who will listen a call or send them a voice note to make your ideas clearer, or just a voice recording for yourself, just like Bruce did. For the backdrop, Bruce sought a European city, keen to be the first Chinese director to film in the West. Kirk Douglas's Colosseum battle in the 1960s movie Spartacus gave Bruce the seed that needed to be planted that he wanted to do something very similar for his final fight in the film. Something so similar, in fact, that Bruce actually chose Rome to be the backdrop. Also inspired by Italy, the backdrop for Clint Eastwood's spaghetti western strategy that saw him at the time, when he was unable to make the jump from TV to movie, just like Bruce Lee here. He traveled to Italy to make western movies there. Bruce wanted to repeat this model for himself because he saw the success of it. He wanted to prove his worth as a western hero by bringing himself and his cheaper budget into the western setting. So for your own art, be on the lookout for tangential models that you too can replicate in order to bring your art into the world in more inventive ways that you might not have considered before. Amongst founders of startups, you'll often hear terms like Uber for X or Airbnb for X. But these are used and might not be necessarily be the optimum ways of finding a new company, but it definitely benefits those who look at your company by associating your company with a company that followed a similar approach and did so successfully. And Bruce was going to use this proven model that Clint Eastwood had laid out before him to demonstrate his potential for higher ups in Hollywood. The book notes that when The Way of the Dragon was in production, this was perhaps Bruce Lee's happiest and certainly most professionally satisfying time. The assistant director, Chang, noted that Bruce couldn't sit still. He was a non-stop engine. You could always see him moving, directing, demonstrating. Even though he could have taken a break at any time, he chose to busy himself in showing his colleagues how to fight, and he'd often tell dirty jokes whilst enlivening the sometimes tense atmosphere of the movie set. This non-stop nature obviously reminds me of what I learned about Christopher Nolan in covering him in this podcast on the set of his films. Long shoots with minimal breaks, but he was always doing something. My favorite story about what Bruce Lee does with his newfound control in making of this film is how he gave his 3 childhood friends, Robert Chan, Unicorn Chan, and Wu Nang, roles in his film. Furthermore, as Unicorn Chan was struggling himself in the movie business, Bruce credited him as the assistant fight choreographer of the film to help boost Chan's career. The lesson here is much more ethical and philosophical, right? Bruce didn't have to do this. After all, when it came to fight choreography, Bruce obviously didn't need an assistant. But perhaps he did this partly because it's what he wished someone had for him earlier, giving him the boost when he needed it. Or perhaps he was mirroring what Stephen Silliphant did for him in writing a script for him, giving him the best lines of the series. Essentially, Bruce Lee decided to be the person he wished others were, kind, generous, even when the leverage was in his favor and the traditionally commercial approach of the movie business didn't promote such generosity. The Way of the Dragon isn't the best film that Bruce Lee was in. The acting across the board is pretty bad. Both the storytelling and cinematography took a big drop after Fist of Fury, but Bruce Lee as an actor himself still brought it. Firstly, he acts his character with far less seriousness than his other roles permitted, incorporating humor into his action in a way that Jackie Chan would later go on to master. The fight scenes are also terrific. Even one features Bruce Lee wielding 2 nunchaku, in order to one-up himself from his fight in Fist of Fury. And the final fight is indeed in the Colosseum, and it's between he and the final henchman, played by none other than the student of his own and the karate legend in his own right, Chuck Norris. And in fact, this was actually his very first film. As the book notes, paying homage to the visual style of Sergio Leone's spaghetti western, Bruce planned a dramatic introduction for the bad guy, Colt, as he steps off the plane at Rome's airport. He asked Chuck Norris to play the role. I was aware that an appearance in a movie, even one made in Hong Kong, might draw more students to our karate schools, Norris said. I had not thought that it could be the start of a new career for me. Chuck Norris has later said of Bruce, the fact is, we are too bad to be his students, and he is too good to be our teacher. Nevertheless, we admire his kung fu, and even though he doesn't treat us as students, we still take him to be our teacher. Of all the martial artists I have met, he is the best. Despite those highlights, even Bruce Lee thought he could do better. Bruce began working on his next film. Within a week of the release of Way of the Dragon, the film was to be called Game of Death. And as the book notes, Bruce's initial notion for this project was that a group of 5 elite martial artists were hired to retrieve a stolen Chinese national treasure from the top floor of a 5-story wooden pagoda in South Korea. The catch? Each level is guarded by an excellent martial artist of a different style who they must defeat to move up a level. I love the sound of this, and if you analyze it, it seems to have a structure that mirrors Bruce's philosophy and approach to martial arts. Bruce spoke of this himself by stating, "What I want to show is the necessity to adapt oneself to changing circumstances. The inability to adapt brings destruction." But it's not just the plot that Bruce would use to make such metaphoric comparisons. Bruce also talked to a Singaporean reporter about his intention for the film's opening image, something more poetic than as an approach Bruce Lee has ever taken in the film medium up until this point. He says, as the film opens, the audience sees a wide expanse of snow. Then the camera closes in on a clump of trees while the sound of a strong gale fills the screen. There is a huge tree in the center of the screen, and it's all covered in thick snow. Suddenly, there's a loud snap, and a huge branch of the tree falls to the ground. It cannot yield to the force of the snow, so it breaks. Then the camera moves to a willow tree, which is bending with the wind. Because it adapts itself to the environment, the willow survives. It's the sort of symbolism which I think Chinese action films should seek to have. In this way, I hope to broaden the scope of action films. That's just beautiful. I love this. Bruce brought together many ideas for the conception of Game of Death, as evidenced by the first fight scene he shot, which is a fulfillment of a dream that he had only somewhat playfully imagined for himself many years ago, because this first fight scene was with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the basketballer that he trained. This was a fight between him and the legendary basketballer, and it did occur, and like Bruce imagined, it ends up being quite the unique spectacle. But here's the thing. If you go to IMDb now, you'll see there is a film called Game of Death, and it does have Bruce Lee in it, posing on the poster in his now famous yellow jumpsuit. And yet, this is not the Game of Death Bruce was talking about. In fact, his version of Game of Death was never finished. The The version of Game of Death you can watch today is one that was made after Bruce Lee's death, which used the same title and the 11 minutes of usable footage that captured Bruce, including his fight with Abdul-Jabbar. But sadly, the rest of the film was not as he imagined. But that doesn't mean that The Way of the Dragon was Bruce Lee's last full appearance in a film, as Bruce actually stopped filming Game of Death himself and shelved it voluntarily to make himself available for the moment he'd been waiting 7 years for. Hollywood, or more specifically Warner Brothers, came knocking on Bruce's door, and they wanted him to play one of the leads of their own kung fu movie. Upon securing his first starring role in Hollywood's kung fu film, Bruce traveled back to Los Angeles, where Warner Brothers put him up in a luxury suite at the Beverly Hills Wilshire Hotel to go over the contract. This is where you'll see, Bruce Lee's ego and comparison-based competitiveness appear in a childish manner again, because in the hotel suite, he immediately phoned all of his old friends, invited them to show off his new temporary accommodation. And, one such friend was the fellow actor Steve McQueen. He was very excited to show off to Steve McQueen, but Steve, knowing Bruce only phoned him to brag, didn't call back and instead sent Bruce a 10x8 glossy photo of himself, autographed with a note attached that simply said, "To Bruce Lee, my biggest fan, Steve McQueen." When Lee and McQueen next finally spoke, Bruce half-seriously shouted, "Steve, you dirty rat, I'm a star now too. I'm a movie star. Don't send me this stuff." Steve McQueen simply laughed back. Now, the film's title on the contract was originally Blood and Steel, but in the midst of negotiations around the contract, along with the directorial control for the film's choreography, Bruce also demanded a name change for the film. Likely knowing that he was going to be sharing the poster with two lead actors, Bruce wanted to make sure that there was absolutely no mistake who the real star of the movie was. And thus, the Little Dragon had his Hollywood movie debut in Enter the Dragon. Even once the contract is signed, there is one dispute that occurs whilst the film is being made that I wanted to highlight from the book. In the original script, Bruce's character is established to be a kind of Chinese James Bond who had actually been recruited by a British agent to arrest the evil Chinese villain, Han. To the American producers and writers, this seems completely unproblematic. In fact, it gives Bruce Lee a favorable role and comparison in regards to the plot. But to Bruce, there is a big problem. As the book points out, this way of his character had been written at this point makes it so that Bruce had reasons to fear that his fans would view him as selling out to the West. And the comparison to 007 would not be helpful either, as the book further notes, to the Hong Kong Chinese, James Bond was an agent of the British Imperial government. When Bruce was growing up, the only people the average Chinese hated more than the British were the Chinese police officers who enforced, often corruptly, their unequal laws. So Bruce made another demand. He asked to direct a new opening sequence to the film that would establish his character as a Shaolin Temple monk with a motivation of familial revenge, with the villain having killed his character's sister, whose death would be shown in a flashback that Bruce also demanded be shot and added to the film. The book notes that by shifting the emphasis from a British operative to a Shaolin monk who was avenging his sister's murder, Bruce was once again playing a heroic defender of the Chinese people. So whilst Bruce Lee didn't necessarily get to play the most progressive roles in Hollywood's TV appearances, as soon as the leverage flipped in his favor and he had a little power over the production, he really used it and ensured that his Chinese audience, where he came from, was not left behind for the values and misunderstandings of the new world that Bruce might have been tempted to simply conform to. The film ultimately does lead to a face-off between the two key Chinese characters, both Bruce Lee and the main villain of Han. However, the original script had Han commit suicide before Lee could capture him. Both Bruce Lee and director Robert Clouse disliked this proposed ending and spent much of the shoot trying to think of a better idea, leaving the filming of this scene to the very end of the shoot. One day after having lunch, Clouse and his wife Anna were walking in a clothing boutique where Clouse noticed that his wife was being presented back to him multiple times in what was a display of several thin mirrors. That's it, Robert Clouse then realized. This arrangement of many thin mirrors, like that you see in a circus hall of mirrors, could be a visually interesting set piece, but also an inventive plot feature that could disadvantage Lee when pitted against a much older Han, which was ideal for making a final confrontation that was both competitive and suspenseful. But also, as the book notes, For Bruce, it was a chance to demonstrate the importance of adaptability in fighting. Lee breaks the mirrors to differentiate between the real Han and his reflection. And it's an amazing scene, by the way. And funny enough, despite the fact that the film included the theme and story beats that were copied from James Bond, the following year after the Enter the Dragon had been released, The Man with the Golden Gun, the James Bond film that had Roger Moore as James Bond both fight in a karate dojo, but also fight the main villain in a hall of mirrors, just like Enter the Dragon. Enter the Dragon would be released in August of 1973. It would go on to be a tremendous commercial success, making over $90 million worldwide in that year alone. And ultimately, it would go on to make Bruce Lee exactly what he set out to do in his acting career, as Enter the Dragon would make him the first and highest paid Oriental superstar in the United States. And on a petty level, it would even outgross his acting rival in Steve McQueen, with Enter the Dragon being a bigger sensation than the previous year's Getaway. But there would be one devastating problem. Our superstar actually died 1 month before the release of the film, passing away in July of 1973. There are many, many rumors and even straight up lies that are told by the newspaper reporters and commentators in the film world who were dissatisfied with their initial lack of detail given to the cause of their new hero's death. But what the book notes as the definitively known version of the story is as follows. On the morning of July 20th, 1973, Bruce wrote a letter to his American lawyer regarding several deals on the table, including a multi-picture offer from Warner Brothers anticipating the upcoming success of Enter the Dragon. There were also offers for books, clothing, and endorsements. You can imagine that Bruce was about to begin building a new kind of empire for himself. And after finishing and posting this letter, he made his way over to the Golden Harvest studio, where he met the one-time James Bond actor, it's funny how that keeps linking back, of the 1969 film On Her Majesty's Secret Service, George Lazenby. Bruce was actually planning to return to the production of Game of Death and wanted George Lazenby to be in it. So not only would he be fighting a 7-foot-tall Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but it would also feature James Bond as an enemy. I mean, how amazing would that have been? After that, Bruce swung by Raymond Chow's office to tell him of his interest to have Lazenby feature in the Game of Death, and Chow suggested that they all go out to dinner together that night to formalize the deal. Bruce then had some hash with a friend who together had planned to take Lazenby out to lunch, but instead Bruce went to fellow actresses Betty Ting Pei's apartment. It's worth noting that Bruce was having an affair with Betty Ting Pei at the time. Bruce then spent the next several hours alone with Betty, the book noting that there was some sex, some hash, but no alcohol or harder drugs. Raymond Chow arrived at Betty's apartment at 6 p.m., the book noting that Bruce was supposed to have returned to the office before then in order to work out a deal for Lazenby. It was a scorching day with temperatures up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit and with a high humidity to go along with it. Chow notes that Bruce wasn't feeling very well. Bruce was out of excitement for Game of Death, telling stories of what he wanted to show on screen, acting out the scenes right there in Betty's one-bedroom apartment. Coming up to 7:30 now, Bruce was feeling faint and complained about having a headache. They were supposed to pick up Lazenby for dinner, but Bruce's headache had worsened. He said he wanted to rest, so Raymond Chow made his way alone, leaving Bruce with Betty. Betty then gave Bruce one of her Equagesic pills, then common prescription pain medication. In fact, she noted that Bruce had taken them before. The book notes, Bruce went into Betty's bedroom, undressed, and sank into a mattress lying on the floor. Betty shut the door to the bedroom and went into the living room and sat down on the couch to watch TV. The idea was that Raymond Chow was going to dinner first, and Bruce and Betty would join later, but they never did. Raymond Chow made several calls to Betty throughout the dinner asking whether Bruce was awake, which he was not. And then, at 9:30, the dinner now finished, Raymond Chow called Betty once more, to which Betty mentioned that Bruce was still asleep, but that this time she would try to wake him. He did not wake. Due to the nature of the Bruce Lee dying in the mistress's bed, the initial press release put out by Raymond Chow tried to spare details in hopes of preserving his image along with Bruce's wife, Linda's. But in fact, by doing so, fumbled by lying and then caught in the lie, helped catalyze all kinds of rumors, theories, and lies that surrounded the topic of his death. The 32-year-old actor may have died in 1973, but in August 1973, a legend was born. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, it seemed to me that Bruce Lee was more a myth than a person. In film, Bruce Lee made way for a new age of cinema by giving birth to American interest in Chinese action movies, talent, and creating a whole new genre, the Kung Fu film. For his family, Bruce secured a financial future, with Bruce Lee even cracking Forbes' ranking in the dollar and cents metric of an icon's continuing star power beyond their passing in 2013, with Bruce landing in 10th place with $7 million, with others on that list being that of Michael Jackson, Elvis Presley, and even Bob Marley. In martial arts, before Lee's death, there were fewer than 500 martial arts schools in the world, yet in the 1990s, because of his influence, there were more than 20 million martial arts students in the US alone. And whilst his teachings in Jeet Kune Do were never taught, something he made sure of, by the way, as he was concerned that it was becoming too much of a style for others to follow, when the idea was to free his students. But despite that, like I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, UFC's own Dana White would refer to Bruce Lee as the godfather of mixed martial arts, as his pragmatic, philosophical approach to martial arts carried into the sport. Before Bruce Lee started working on Game of Death, and more completely on Enter the Dragon, he actually wrote a treatment for a film that I believe has Bruce Lee's best artistic ideas in it that he ever conceived of, and if made, I believe would have been his greatest film. If that film treatment interests you, I've actually summarized and analyzed it in a bonus PDF that I've made available for free in a link in the podcast show notes. I also attached a summary of the episode's key lessons, quotes, and takeaways in that PDF, so you can start applying those ideas from Bruce Lee's life and work into your work right away. Also, for more icons, follow Icons Podcast on LinkedIn to discover weekly creativity tips from history's greatest artists. And whatever you may find yourself listening to this currently on, just know that Icons is available across every platform you can think of. I'm talking YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Amazon Music, Pocket Cast, and much more. And YouTube also has some additional clip content as well, so do check that out. And, wherever you prefer to listen to your podcast, please subscribe there. And if you can, leave us a review if you enjoyed this episode. And with that, I've been Justin Campbell-Platt. This is Icons. Thank you for listening.